Genshin Impact, a tragic story told in blood, tears throughout thousands of years, spanning across Teyvat. Genshin Impact is my favorite game of all time, and as you all know, the sheer magnitude of story and lore sprinkled across every aspect of this game is honestly nothing short of astonishing. And we aren't even done yet, we still have 4 nations to go and Celestia. So in this video, I will be covering the entire timeline of Teyvat, from the very beginning of history up until our current events in Sumeru, and I will even be predicting where we are headed, as well as the identity of characters long speculated on. We have a lot more information compared to when the game first dropped, and although the timeline is very concrete now, some uncertainties like time jumps, reasons for certain events, and things like that, I will be using the best educated guesses possible from myself and the community. Also, I should note, I will be assuming that you've played the main Archon story right up until its current state in 3.3, so if not, spoilers, but with that out of the way, I hope you all enjoy this. Let us take a deep dive into the tragic history of Teyvat. In the beginning, before the Heavenly Principles, before the Archons, before the 7 nations and even the entirety of humanity, there was just Teyvat. And in this ancient times, the only creatures who inhabited this land are the dragons and Vishops, and the 7 primal sovereign dragon lords who ruled over this world, and each of the 7 dragons representing one of the elements. So in a way you could say, the original Archons of this world. These ancient times predate all other history of Teyvat, and the world itself was said to be very different and the lands uninhabitable by humans, a land that the dragons and Vishops alike thrived in, the environment tailored to them. It is unknown how long this period of time lasted, and I will refer to this time as the Age of the Dragons, or AD. Before one day, an alien visitor, an unknown being from another world, who would later be known as the Primordial One or Primordial One, the original first ever god, or ancestral god, who allegedly came to Teyvat from another world. This god would also be known as Thanos. Thanos, after arriving in Teyvat, would battle against and defeat the 7 sovereign dragon lords who ruled Teyvat. It is unknown who initiated this battle or conflict, but this battle took over 40 years. And in the end, Thanos would defeat the 7 sovereign dragon lords. For the remaining Vishops and dragon creatures who lived in Teyvat, that were bitter about their defeat, would refuse to live under the new rule and would flee to the Dark Sea. Thanos would then go on to create the heavens and earth for the sake of humanity. It would also create 4 shades, or could be interpreted as 4 angels, God and his angels, since it's based off of real-world religion. One of these shades would be known as Esteroth, the god of time, who we learned about in the 4 Winds Temple. The earth, the trees, the water, the air, and all life forms would all be created and tailored for the arrival of humans and gods alike. Also, it should be noted that in the artifact domain you can see the 5 crowns above, where you are bestowed artifacts. These crowns and the artifacts themselves represent the Primordial One and his 4 angels or shades, and each artifact actually represents one of them. The crown representing the Primordial One or Thanos, the timepiece representing Esteroth, the god of time, the goblet representing the god of space, and the flower and feather representing both respectively the god of life and death, which is why the flower can only be HP, which represents life, and the feather is only an attack stat, which represents death. The artifacts come from Celestia, bestowed upon the player after completing the domain. It has also been said that Thanos was recorded to wear a crown, which also suits why he would be the crown artifact. According to the scribe of Esteroth, the god of time, who wrote before Sun and Moon, the Primordial One held humanity in very high esteem, creating the heavens and earth in a way that would be suitable for humanity. And according to the scribe, as long as humans were happy, it too would be happy and rejoice. In short, The Primordial One was a benevolent god and a good god, regardless of its true identity before arriving in Teyvat, for Thanos would be known as the one true god. The entirety of Teyvat at this point wouldn't know anything different outside of the Primordial One, Thanos, always being there as their god and ruler of Celestia, creating life and the living heaven. All except the original bishops who fled into the Dark Sea outside of Thanos' rule and the light of the sun, hidden from the rest of the world. Genshin's lore itself is based off of many real-world religions, but its main story very heavily focused on Gnosticism. The Primordial One creations were known as the ancient civilizations we see across Teyvat, and records of this era best preserved in Economia, but also on Dragonspine, the Chasm, Sarami Island, and the Sumeru Desert. No doubt we will find more of these ruins and ancient civilizations in the next regions to come. It is not stated just how long humanity and gods alike lived and prospered like this, because most humans and god alive today were not even around, and this predates all of the major events in Genshin today. Even Morax, the Geo Archon, the oldest of the Archons, wasn't even born yet. So we will refer to this era as the PA, the Primordial Era, or Primordial Age. Of course, nothing lasts forever, and inevitably, the day came when another descender arrived in Teyvat. The second who came, second throne of the heavens, appeared and restarted the war. The heavens and earth were torn apart, and during this period of strife, Economia dropped into the watery abyss of the Dark Sea, along with the bishops from the AD, Age of the Dragons. They would then need to defend themselves from the bishops, who have dwelled in the Dark Sea for thousands upon thousands of years. Despite the people's plea for help, the Primordial One and 3 of its shades did not respond to their plea, perhaps being tangled in a war with the second who came. Only Istaroth, the god of time, responded to their aid and did not forsake them. When the people of Economia pleaded to return to the surface world, they were denied, which led the Shade of Time to believe the Primordial One and its 3 other shades to actually survive and be the victors of the war between 2 alien descenders. It was fortunate Thanos was victorious, but the people would notice a difference in their beloved god, the Primordial One. Their once benevolent god would turn on them all, and it would seek to erase and destroy these civilizations, as we see with the celestial nails, sent from the heavens in both Dragonspine and the Chasm. The banishment of Economia, and whatever fate may have fell Sarami Island. I'm sure we'll see more as we unlock more nations, but why? Why would their god do this? Why purge all its creations and civilizations? Thanos wanted to clean slate the world, wipe the original existence off the face of the earth, even from memory. The great serpent god Orobashi was even sentenced to death by Celestia for learning this. The old original world of the Primordial One was forbidden. This was later known, as we learn in Sumeru, as forbidden knowledge. But why? After the defeat of the second who came, Thanos would invoke war and chaos across Teyvat from all its ancient gods and beings living there. And this period would be known as the Archon War, where 7 Archons would emerge victorious that we know today. This would become known as the Archon War, which we learned a lot about in-game. And all of the gods and ancient beings alike would go into a long, gruesome war, such as the Thunderbird, the Yakshas, Osial, and many more. And as we know, 7 gods, now known as Archons, would emerge victorious, and would rule over their respective nations, representing each element. They were all given a gnosis that would give Celestia total control over the 7, or as I like to call this new age, Age of the 7. In the age of our current game, the days of old would be lost and forgotten. But of course, as we know, even in the real world, there will always be a few survivors and descendants will emerge. Now we get closer to our current story in Genshin Impact. Khaenri'ah, descendants of the ancient civilizations and still a remnants of the old, We can only speculate at this point what exactly happened to them. But it would make sense that Khaenri'ah learned what we learned in the Chasm and Economia, what the Jester, the Dore, the Tsaritsa already knew, and what Orobashi died learning, and Scaramouche himself learned through the event in 1.1. It's all one gigantic hoax. A lie. The false sky and the lie that is Teyvat. For the truth is that the Primordial One didn't actually forsake its world and people after all, but was actually defeated by the second who came, the second descender, the heavenly principles, the unknown god, the sustainer. And she deceived the world into thinking she had lost the war, but it was her who destroyed the original civilizations of Teyvat with the celestial nails, and took the throne for herself. She ruled as an imposter, pretending to be the Faunus. The Sustainer defeated Faunus. She invoked the Archon War and created her own new world order through the Seven. This was the lie. The Sustainer was Solomon, the Archons all of her demons to rule for her, hence their demon names. Everything everyone knew, the Archons being just the world of prosperity, one big lie. This is the truth of this world hidden by Irminsul that Dore mentions.
Let me ask you, have you in all your mighty knowledge ever heard the rumor that the skies of Teyvat are fake?
Huh?
That's the secret hidden by Irminsul concerning the truth of this world.
So essentially, in a way, every nation is ruled by a demon who answers to Solomon. Call it what you will. Economia and its people, after being denied return to the surface and forsaken by Faunus, who we know now was actually the Sustainer, they had to survive, and long story short, found a way to defend themselves from the bishops, and created an artificial sun we see today. They would be saved from the Dragon of the Depths, the Dragonair, by the great serpent god Orobashi, who is believed to fled Teyvat during the Archon War, and headed to the Dark Sea. They would form a civilization there with their ultimate goal to one day be able to return to the surface. The memory of the old world, the Primordial One, would almost be completely wiped from history and memory. But Economia is one such place outside Teyvat where that knowledge was preserved. Many years would go by and Orobashi would raise this civilization from the depths as their savior, using the coral of its back to create Watsumi Island, and would learn the truth of what happened. Being one of the very few at this time who knew the truth of the war, the second who came, and reading Before Sun and Moon by Esteroth, the god of time. And as we learn in Economia, learning this forbidden knowledge, Orobashi, the great serpent god, was sentenced to death by Celestia. As we know, history is often written by the winners, and it was long believed by the people of Inazuma that Orobashi attacked Yashiori Island to conquer new land and save his people from famine. Watsumi Island could not grow food, and starvation threatened his people. They viewed him as a warmongering god, but the truth was he had no choice. Celestia offered him an ultimatum. He could sacrifice himself, or his people be annihilated. He chose to make it look like an invasion, to cover up his forbidden knowledge, knowing full well the shogun would defeat him. And sure enough, he was slain. But before his death, would share this knowledge with a select few who would safeguard it far away in Economia, the watery abyss, hidden behind trials and puzzles so that the truth could be preserved for someone powerful enough to survive learning this forbidden knowledge one day. That was the sacrifice the great serpent god made, and being one of the very few at this time who knew the existence of the truth of the old world created by Faunus, the original god, I also find it interesting knowing Saganomiya Kokomi is a descendant of these people from Economia, who were from the ancient civilizations created by Faunus. And Kokomi happens to be leading the rebellion of the Vision Hunt Decree, who is led by the Shogun, who is an agent of the heavenly principles, the second who came. Funny twist of fate, you could say. But as we know in Genshin, coincidences are very few and far in between. Also makes way more sense now knowing why the original civilizations were purged, being that it was actually the second who came that won the war. To the original civilizations, she would only ever be known as the second who came, an alien invader, and wiping out the old world would allow her to rewrite the world in her own way, creating a world under her own law. And this was the false world we see Teyvat in today. Annihilating everything while pretending to be the primordial one was surely the final nail in the coffin, quite literally. Truly devastating. And nobody alive today in the new world under the 7 Archons would ever know the truth about the old world, about the primordial one, and the old civilization's destruction. So we think. Perhaps one nation lived and thrived outside this new world order, as we know as Khaenri'ah, created its own army, extraordinary mechanisms, man-made gods, and powers we can only imagine, to challenge and go to war with the Sustainer for their descendants. It is implied by the first Fatoui Harbinger, the Jester, who is a royal mage of Khaenri'ah at this time, that they are very much aware of what happened to the original world of Teyvat, and even hints that the old world, the one his ancestors thrived in, would be Signora's final resting place.
Now you rest in this coffin, encased in layer upon layer of ice. But Rosaline, I promise you, your final resting place will be the entirety of the old world.
Implying they would succeed in their ultimate mission to overthrow the heavenly principles. So it can be assumed Khaenri'ah shared this mission, hence why they thrived outside the 7 and invoked the Cataclysm. It is unclear 100% who directly started this war, but it would seem the Sustainer realized this threat and took matters into her own hands before they could become too powerful. Similar to how Orobashi was sentenced to die for learning about the old world, perhaps Khaenri'ah was also sentenced to death, as they know the truth behind everything. And Khaenri'ah would ultimately pay the price, as the Archons were summoned by force to destroy this nation. Many were killed, the land torn apart, the Archons themselves shaken up by what they had to do, including the Red and Shogun, being terrified of what had happened, and mourning the loss of her sister Makoto. She sealed herself away in the plain of Euthymia, and hold true to eternity, preventing her nation from striving with too much progression, as we seen what it could bring. The remaining Khaenri'ahs outside of the select few survivors were turned into abyssal monsters to this day. This is where our story begins, the opening cutscene.
So, what you're trying to say is that you fell here from another world? But when you wanted to leave and go on to the next world, your path was blocked by some unknown god?
Outlanders, your journey ends here. Who are you? The sustainer of heavenly principles. The arrogation of mankind ends now.
Give my sister back!
We know the Sustainer prevented us from leaving, but what happened after this? Our sibling would live out their journey while we stayed in a sleep until we wake up and meet Paimon. From here, it is very simple, really. We awake amidst the Great Plan, a plan created by the Tsaritsa, the Cryo-Archon, and carried out by the most infamous group of people in Teyvat. The 11 Fatoui Harbingers, picking up where Khaenri'ah left off, Piero himself being the first Harbinger and a Royal Mage survivor from Khaenri'ah. Piero stated already what they intend to do: seize authority of this world from the gods, from Celestia, from the Sustainer. The Archons. But how? The Cryo-Archon was the god of love, and she was the most torn by being forced to destroy an entire nation under the Sustainer's order. It should be noted, none of the Archons we meet so far seemed very pleased with this action, but more so reluctant. Venti, Zhongli, and even the Raiden Shogun after her sister's death. Nahida was not present, but we can safely assume the two remaining Archons would feel something similar. The Archons are slaves after all. That is why they don't appear to be evil, but have demon names under the Sustainer's rule. Because of Tsaritsa allying herself with the Jester to remove the heavenly principles, they would recruit extraordinary people from all across Teyvat, the Crimson Witch of Flames from Mondstadt to the all-powerful Shogun Pumpet in Inazuma, even ancient beings that might pre-exist the second who came, for the sole purpose to infiltrate each nation, seize the Gnosis from the Archons, cutting off the ties and control the Sustainer has on them. But as we've seen, especially with the Dore in Sumeru and Nahida, they do not really wish to start a war with the Archons themselves. And the Archons, for the most part, seem to be aware of this and on board. Let's look back. Both Barbados and Morax, also known as Venti and Zhongli, were both present during the destruction of Khaenri'ah, and don't really like to talk about it. Venti did not really put up much of a fight for his Gnosis, and Zhongli already made a contract with the Tsaritsa to give his up, in exchange for the services of the Harbingers to see if his nation could handle the times ahead without him, for he was looking to retire and feared erosion that was inevitable for him. Nahida exchanged hers for knowledge, but what about the Raiden Shogun? What about A? When the time comes for the final war, they will need her, but she is hidden herself in the plane of Euthymia, and is terrified of what wrath the heavenly principles or erosion could bring, so has hidden herself away to avoid the problems. The Jester would have to be creative to get her out of hiding. Do you find it a little suspicious that Yaimiko already happened to be at the Delusion Factory to meet Scaramouche, unknowing that we would be there, just at the right time, and stated she has been keeping A's Gnosis for years at the Grand Narukami Shrine? So why would she have her Gnosis with her on hand to meet Scaramouche? A little too suspicious. And as we know, with Genshin Impact, there are very few coincidences. This was a planned exchange, and Signora's death no coincidence. Yaimiko needed A to snap out of her funk, and the nation freed, while the Jester needed the Gnosis in Scaramouche's hands to begin experiments with the Dore, the Doctor, and Sumeru. So they had to come up with a plan that would benefit both. Signora was sacrificed and was sent there with the intention to get the Gnosis, but stood no chance, for for Scaramouche already had it at the Delusion Factory. She was a sacrifice, a pawn, and in the grand game, deliberately to prevent the Traveler from being killed instantly by the Shogun, and Kazuha with the resistance ready to go when the time came to help the Traveler. And all part of Yaimiko and the Jester's plan to get A out of hiding and back into her senses for the war ahead, as they would need her. This would also allow the Doctor the chance to experiment with a Gnosis and make potential man-made gods for his inventions and experiments to help in the coming wars against the Sustainer. That is where we are in the current story. And as we can see from the higher ranking Harbingers, they seem to know pretty much exactly what is going on, and they seem to know the history of Teyvat themselves, as the Dore shared this knowledge with Nahida for her own Gnosis, the Dendrognosis. And this is also why Yaimiko was in the plane of Euthymia with us, ready to go, to ensure our victory. As you've probably noticed throughout the story, anyone who remembers or is aware of the old world of the Primordial One despises the current Celestia and its Archons, such as Dainsleif, or the Harbingers, or even the Tsaritsa. We are currently what I like to call in Phase 1 of the Fatoui's grand plans, something that Khaenri'ah failed to do, eliminating the Archon's interference by seizing every Gnosis. That way, going to war with Celestia, they will not have to worry about the Archons, but rather so might even have allies in the Archons. So they will no longer be a threat. I'm not 100% sure what exactly Phase 2 will be, but I believe in the end, we will inevitably go to war alongside the Fatoui, the Archons, and everyone who wants to rid Celestia from the second who came. With all of that said, there are still a lot of unanswered questions, but I'm sure by now you can figure out who is most likely the Primordial One, the original descender of Teyvat. That's right. Even the Abyss Herald in Economia hinted something like this. We've known since 1.0 when the game dropped. She is not from this world, and there is something much more about her. The uncanny similarities to a Celestia, her good nature, her crown. She isn't recognized by anyone in the current world today, and similar to the Stove God, would most likely be in a weakened state and appear smaller. Possibly not even know her own identity at this moment. But who else better to be both our traveling companion and the mascot of the game than the Primordial One herself, Faunus, the one who started it all? It just makes way too much sense. Who else besides Paimon could it be? Plus, to boot, her symbol literally means real, and the Chinese translation for Genshin is God. She is the most interesting and unique being in the entire game, and being right in front of us the whole time. The original god of Teyvat. Like literally, the symbol on her chest can be found in all of the locations where the ancient civilizations lived. Right there in plain sight. People have been speculating on Paimon for years, but even her demon name could be symbolic of the Sustainer Solomon overthrowing her and her now living in exile under her rule, in the weakened state. A good parallel to this is sort of like Midna and Zant from Twilight Princess, a queen of the Twilight Realm, and Zant usurped her using the powers from Ganondorf lent to him, and Midna was transformed into a small impish weakened state and exiled. A funny similarity. Her name, the Primordial One, is where the Primogems come from. And Paimon literally has a Primogem right on her. Now coming back to those original 7 dragons, the rulers of Teyvat before the Primordial One, I believe that they were not killed, as the Primordial One was known as a benevolent god, and to battle them for 40 years would suggest that maybe she wasn't trying to kill them. I believe that all of the elemental hypostasis we see around the map were the original 7 dragons, in a weakened transformed state, either by the Primordial One or the Sustainer, hence their cube-like powers and them representing cubes now. Is it possible that maybe after their defeat, they served the Primordial One as the original Archons, or elemental gods with their respective nation? And the Archons we know today are the Sustainer's demon counterparts to these original 7 dragons, or now hypostasis. I also find it interesting that their names are from the Hebrew alphabet, and they all translate to the angels that are the direct counterparts of the Archon demons. Another small link that you could find into the hypostasis being the dragons originally is that Sucrose can replicate or make a mini hypostasis using small creatures such as lizards. Lizards being in the family of dragons, just smaller version. And where did Sucrose learn alchemy? From Albedo. And Albedo being a creation of Khaenri'ah, a nation that are the descendants of the ancient civilization under Thanos, who potentially ruled over these dragons. There is a small connection. Now, it is unclear, and this is all speculation on this point, what the hypostasises are, and if the dragons actually survived the war with the Primordial One, and if it was the Sustainer that actually imprisoned them in these cubes. I find it a little coincidental that their names and the fact that they are cubes lines up perfectly with the demon counterparts, and the fact that the Sustainer and possibly Paimon, the Primordial One, had cube-like powers. I just find the similarities a little too coincidental. But again, at this point, we can only speculate. Now, we do have one more unanswered question. Who exactly is the Traveler? We've covered and condensed the entire story of Genshin Impact, and the timeline leading up to the current events, and speculated on future events, of how it all ends. But what about the Traveler? We can only speculate on this, and I think there are a few options. The Traveler could be one of the primordial shades, the angels, which makes sense why we are companions with the Primordial One herself. Perhaps the Shade of Life and Death, represented by the feather and flower artifacts. And Lumine actually has a flower on her design, perhaps. And this would also make sense why the characters can be interchangeable, meaning you could select either Lumine or Ether for your main character without actually affecting the story, no matter who you pick, because both would be shades to the Primordial One, our companion, Paimon. They could also be these two shown in the Battle Pass cutscene.
Once, there was a glorious kingdom established among the heavens. From that kingdom came a crowned heir, tasked with seeking out the Genesis Pearl from the Kingdom of Darkness. The first crowned heir began her journey of seeking the Pearl. But she was deceived, and the memory of her noble origins faded. She now believed that she was the queen of the Kingdom of Darkness. But take heart. A second crowned heir had already taken up the path where the first had stumbled. This is the story of your journey, of your tale to be told.
And that the Genesis Orb could be from the nation of Khaenri'ah that Lumine went down to retrieve and was corrupted in the Abyss. Because we know Khaenri'ah was said to experiment and dabble into the Abyss and abyssal magic a lot. This could make sense, and it could align with what the Jester said in the artifact set, the Pale Flame, that the sages did not listen to him, so that they got the ultimate punishment. There are a lot of options that this could be. It is still a mystery. They could just honestly be unknown descenders from a random world we have not heard of or don't know. In Genshin Impact, what really is a god? It's a very vague, thrown around term. We have gods that are lower tier. We have the Archons that are the apex winners of the Archon War. We have the Shades that could be interpreted more as angels than gods. And we have the original two. But are they really gods? Or are they ultimately just visitors from another world, perceived as gods? Because what really is a god? A god is a creator of life in a sense, and even in our own real world, we would view a god as someone that is creator of all. For those that lived under the Primordial one, that is all they ever knew. But in reality, would they not just be alien visitors? I do find the interesting parallels between our own world and Genshin very interesting because, like Genshin, in our own world there are so many unanswered questions about what's out there, and no one really knows. But it's interesting to think on. Which again brings us to our current story in Sumeru, and the theme around that nation being wisdom and forbidden knowledge being heavily talked about is something we learn in Sumeru. The most forbidden knowledge being the primordial one. And the Sustainer must ensure this old world remains forgotten at all costs. Although she appears to be the main villain, it makes sense if you think about it. You can't really have everyone knowing you're basically an alien invader who killed the original benevolent god and completely annihilated the original inhabitants of this world. And if you know this information, as we've seen, it puts you in grave danger, which makes sense why our sibling would potentially be hiding with this information in the abyss. But one question is, why would the Sustainer prevent us from leaving Teyvat? That is something maybe you guys could help me with. To prevent the story perhaps from being told in other worlds? To prevent this knowledge from spreading outside this planet? I hope to God we get a full-size, full-powered Paimon versus the Sustainer as the final battle to see who rules over Teyvat and Celestia as the ultimate good versus evil showdown. That is where this all leads, but who can say exactly? And another thing, maybe this story ends with no ruler of Teyvat, and maybe once we defeat the Sustainer, Paimon ultimately destroys and steps down from her role as the primordial one and the original god. Perhaps that is the true meaning of this game, after all, and where this is all headed. For we've seen in stories told in our own world that there should not be a ruler, no Celestia, and that humanity should be able to decide its own fate and control its own destiny. As we've seen, when there is evil and people trying to dictate what will be, there will always be people who resist. This is inevitable. And perhaps this is the true meaning of the story in Genshin Impact, and where this all leads. To the inevitable destruction of Celestia, and the concept of gods and archons, and rulers over the people, and beings and creatures of Teyvat, and that everyone should be able to control their own destiny and live in peace in this grand world, thrive with each other, and dictate their own fates. That could very well be the very meaning of Genshin Impact, but at the end of the day, this is just my theory on how this game ends, because the story will not be told for another good 2 to 3 years, as we have Fontaine, Natlin, Shesnaya, Khaenri'ah, and maybe some other realm that we have to visit next for an update. It is hard to say, but it's interesting to talk about. And everything up to the current events we know, and predicting the future, we have very good educated guesses we can make, but ultimately, we have to wait and see how the story unfolds, what characters come to light, and what will happen to the world of Teyvat. I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I wanted to start the new year off with a bang, and really just dive deep into the entire story. Believe it or not, even though this video is much longer than my usual uploads, it was hard to leave a lot of information out, as this video could have easily been hours long. There is so much rich lore in this game, so to condense it was hard, and I even plan on making a more condensed version, but I did my best to try to tell the entire timeline of Genshin in a cohesive story format, while also trying to use my best educated guesses and different information I've gathered through playing, texts, artifacts, books, and the community to try to predict where the game is headed in the future. So with that said, I hope you all enjoyed, thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next video. Later.